For 3,000 years, one of the most consequential kings in human history did not exist. His name was chiseled off every monument that had ever borne it. His statues were smashed and buried in the foundations of other people's buildings. His face was hammered off temple walls until nothing remained but the shape of where a face had once been. The city he had built from nothing in the middle of the desert was abandoned within a year of his death, stripped for stone, and left to be swallowed by the sand. His own son helped erase him. The generals who came after finished the job. By the time Egyptian civilization ended and passed into Greek hands, and then Roman, and then Arab, nobody remembered him at all. He was not in the king lists. He was not in the priestly records. When the great historian Manetho compiled the definitive account of Egypt's pharaohs in the 3rd century before Christ, this king's name was simply not there. He had vanished so completely that the very concept of him, that such a person had ever sat on the throne of Egypt, was gone. And yet, 1,700 years before Christ, this king had tried to do something that, if it had worked, would have changed the religious history of the entire human species. He had almost pulled it off. They didn't just forget him by accident. Somebody in the years right after his death decided the world would be safer if he had never existed. And they nearly succeeded. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh they tried to erase, and why. To understand why anyone would want to erase a pharaoh from history, and why they nearly succeeded, you have to understand the Egypt that Akhenaten inherited. Because the country he was born into, around 1360 before Christ, was not a young kingdom trying to find its footing. It was the wealthiest, most powerful, most culturally dominant civilization on Earth, and it had been that way for close to 2,000 years. 2,000 years. That number is worth sitting with, because it is longer than the entire span of history from the birth of Christ to the present day. Egyptian civilization was already older by the time Akhenaten came into the world than the modern era is old today. When his ancestors were building the pyramids at Giza, that construction was already 14 centuries behind him. He grew up in a country whose greatest works were not future projects, but ancient inheritance. He walked as a child through temples that had been standing for longer than most modern nations have existed. The Egypt of the 14th century before Christ was at what historians now call the height of the New Kingdom. It was ruled by the 18th dynasty, a line of kings who had, over roughly 200 years, transformed Egypt from a regional power into a genuine empire. Egyptian armies had marched into what is now Syria, Lebanon, and northern Iraq. Vassal kings from Babylon to Cyprus sent tribute to the pharaoh in Thebes. Gold flowed into the Egyptian treasury from mines in Nubia, from trade routes across the Mediterranean, from the endless taxation of a population of perhaps 3 or 4 million people who worked the fields along the Nile. And that gold flowed overwhelmingly into one specific set of hands: the priesthood of Amun. Amun was the state god. He had not always been. In the deep past of Egyptian history, other gods had held that role: Ptah in Memphis, Ra in Heliopolis, Osiris in the funerary cult that governed how Egyptians thought about death. But over the centuries, as Thebes had risen to become the political capital of the kingdom, the local god of Thebes, Amun, had been elevated, merged with the older sun god Ra, and eventually promoted to a status essentially equivalent to a national deity. Amun-Ra, king of the gods, hidden and revealed at the same time. The unseen power behind everything that mattered. The temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor were, by Akhenaten's time, so enormous that they still, 3,000 years later, rank among the largest religious structures ever built by human beings. The great temple of Amun at Karnak alone covered an area larger than most modern cities' downtowns. Its central hall contained 134 stone columns, some more than 60 feet tall, arranged in ranks that made the space feel less like a building and more like a stone forest, deliberately grown by the gods. And every one of those temples was staffed. Priests of Amun numbered in the tens of thousands. They controlled vast estates of farmland, herds of cattle, warehouses of grain, workshops full of skilled craftsmen. Some estimates place the wealth controlled by the Amun priesthood at rivaling, or possibly exceeding, the wealth controlled by the pharaoh himself. When a king wanted to go to war, he had to negotiate with the priesthood for resources. When a king wanted to build a monument, he had to secure their approval. When a king died, it was the priesthood that presided over his funeral rites and decided how history would remember him. This was not a religious institution in the modern sense. There was no separation of church and state in 14th century Egypt because the state itself was, at its foundation, religious. The pharaoh was not just a political ruler. He was the intermediary between the human world and the divine, the earthly incarnation of Horus, the son of the gods, the guarantor of cosmic order. His legitimacy came from the gods, and the gods spoke in official practice through the priesthood, which meant the priesthood, over centuries, had accumulated something dangerous. They had become powerful enough to potentially outweigh the throne itself. Akhenaten's father, the great pharaoh Amenhotep III, seems to have understood this problem clearly. During his long and extraordinarily prosperous 38-year reign, he began quietly and carefully to elevate other gods to positions of prominence. He built temples to gods other than Amun. He gave particular attention to a relatively minor solar deity called the Aten, literally the sun disk, the physical disk of the sun visible in the sky. It was a subtle shift. Nobody at the time appears to have registered it as a threat. Amenhotep III died around 1353 before Christ, after a reign that had made Egypt richer and more secure than perhaps any period in its history. His son inherited everything: the gold, the empire, the subtle religious tension his father had left behind, unfinished for the next generation to resolve. Nobody who watched the coronation of the new pharaoh, a young man named Amenhotep IV, taking his father's throne name, had any idea what he was actually about to do. The first years of Amenhotep IV's reign gave almost no warning of what was coming. He was crowned around 1353 before Christ, probably in his late teens or early 20s. He married a woman whose name would eventually become more famous than his own, Nefertiti, whose extraordinary limestone bust, discovered at Amarna in 1912, remains one of the most reproduced images of ancient Egypt in the modern world. Her origins are disputed. Some scholars believe she was Egyptian nobility. Others have argued she may have been foreign, possibly Mitanni, from what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that she was, from the very beginning of the reign, an unusually prominent presence. Egyptian queens were traditionally depicted at a smaller scale than the pharaohs they served. Nefertiti appears in some of the earliest images from her husband's reign, at the same size as the king himself. An artistic choice with no clear precedent in Egyptian royal iconography. They had 6 daughters together over the course of the reign, no sons who survived infancy, at least none that appear in the official record with Nefertiti as their mother. That detail would matter enormously by the end. For the first 4 or 5 years, Amenhotep IV governed Egypt in a manner that would have looked, to any external observer, entirely conventional. He completed monuments his father had started. He maintained the traditional temple hierarchy. He appeared at religious festivals wearing the correct regalia, performing the correct rituals, honoring the correct gods. Amun was praised. Osiris was honored. The Egyptian pantheon, hundreds of deities that had been worshipped in various combinations for 2 millennia, remained the official religious framework of the state. But something was already changing if you knew where to look. In the temple complexes he ordered built during those first years, a specific god was being given unusual prominence. Not Amun, not any of the other established major deities, the Aten, the solar disk, the relatively minor solar entity that his father had begun to elevate quietly during the previous reign. At Karnak, the great temple complex of Amun himself, the heart of the priesthood's power, Amenhotep IV ordered the construction of a series of buildings dedicated specifically to the Aten, not replacing anything, just adding. Enormous open-air structures with no roofs, designed so that the sun's disk could be worshipped directly, unmediated, its light falling onto altars and offerings without any barrier of stone or shadow between the sun and the ceremony. Traditional Egyptian temples were dark. Their innermost sanctuaries were sealed, torchlit, accessible only to priests. What Amenhotep IV was building at Karnak was, architecturally, the opposite of what an Egyptian temple was supposed to be. The priesthood of Amun watched this happen. There is no surviving record of what they thought about it, but the pattern is unmistakable in retrospect. The young king was signaling through the medium of architecture that his religious priorities were not going to align cleanly with the institution that had, for centuries, defined what those priorities should be. Around the 5th year of his reign, approximately 1348 before Christ, the signaling stopped and something else began. Amenhotep IV made 3 decisions in rapid succession that shattered any pretense of continuity with the past. He changed his name. He shut down the traditional temples. He announced that the gods of Egypt, as they had been understood for 2,000 years, were finished. The name change came first, and it was the most explicit statement of intent that any Egyptian pharaoh had ever made. Amenhotep meant Amun is satisfied, a name that literally embedded the state god into the pharaoh's own identity, as generations of his ancestors had done before him. He replaced it. The new name he chose was Akhenaten. It meant, in Egyptian, effective for the Aten, or in some translations, the living spirit of the Aten. It was in essence a renunciation of his entire birth identity, refashioned into a declaration of loyalty to a single deity. This was not a gesture. It was a policy statement, encoded in the pharaoh's own name, that would from that day forward have to be written into every royal proclamation, every diplomatic letter, every carved inscription across an empire that stretched from Nubia to Syria. Every scribe in Egypt would have to physically write the word Aten thousands of times over the course of the coming years. Every time they did, they would be participating in the erasure of the god their ancestors had worshipped. The name change was the smaller of the shocks. What came next was the moment when the entire religious infrastructure of the ancient world, the temples, the priesthoods, the cosmic order that Egypt believed had held the universe together since the beginning of time, came under direct attack from the throne that was supposed to protect it. The order came down from the throne, and it was unlike anything Egypt had ever heard. The temples of Amun were to be closed, not reformed, not restructured, closed. Their priests were to be dismissed. Their treasuries were to be seized by the crown. The name Amun itself was to be chiseled off every monument it appeared on, throughout the entire kingdom, wherever the state had authority to reach. Think about what that actually required. Amun had been worshipped in one form or another for more than 1,000 years. His name was carved into temple walls that stretched across the entire Nile Valley. It appeared on tombs, on stelae, on the personal amulets that ordinary Egyptians wore around their necks for protection. It was in the birth names of half the population, because Egyptians named their children after the gods they worshipped, and Amun was the most commonly invoked deity in the entire pantheon. Erasing him meant sending workmen with chisels into every temple, every tomb, every public inscription in the kingdom, and defacing thousands of years of accumulated religious inheritance. The workmen went. The chisels came out. The name of Amun began to disappear from Egyptian surfaces, one hammer blow at a time. And it wasn't only Amun. Akhenaten's decree extended, eventually, to the entire pantheon. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, without whom no Egyptian believed a proper burial could ensure the soul's survival, was diminished, though not entirely abolished. Isis, Horus, Ptah, Thoth, the dozens of local gods that different regions and cities had worshipped for generations. All of it was to be subordinated, or in some cases silenced entirely, to a single principle. There was to be one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun. This is the moment that matters, and it is the moment that most casual retellings of Akhenaten's story fail to communicate the full weight of. Because what Akhenaten was doing had never been done before, anywhere in human history, by any civilization we have evidence of. He was inventing monotheism, not adopting it, not reforming an existing tradition to emphasize a single god within an accepted pantheon. Inventing it, declaring as state policy that only one god actually existed and that every other god that had been worshipped throughout Egyptian history was in fact not real. The Aten alone was divine. Everything else was error. The dating on this matters. The great monotheistic traditions we associate with Western religious history, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all trace their theological roots to a religious development that occurred, in most modern scholarly reconstructions, somewhere in the Levant during the roughly 700 years after Akhenaten's death. The Hebrew Bible, in its earliest layers, still contains fragments of what appears to have been an older polytheistic Israelite religion that only gradually consolidated into strict monotheism during the exile in Babylon in the 6th century before Christ. Akhenaten was doing something roughly analogous, but 7 centuries earlier, in the most powerful state in the ancient world. If it had held, if the reform had lasted beyond his own lifetime, the entire religious history of the Mediterranean and everything that flowed from it would look different. Egyptian monotheism, imposed by the wealthiest and most influential empire of the age, would have shaped the neighboring cultures that would eventually produce the biblical tradition. The idea of a single god might have entered human religious consciousness not through a small tribal people in the Levantine hills, but through the pharaonic court of the New Kingdom 6 or 7 centuries earlier. Akhenaten came astonishingly close to making that happen. To cement the revolution and physically separate himself from the priesthood he had just disempowered, he made one final decision that ranks among the most audacious acts of political theater in ancient history. He would leave Thebes, not just move the court, abandon the ancient capital entirely. He would build a new city from nothing in the middle of the desert, on a stretch of land that had never before been consecrated to any god, so that the Aten could reign there without any older divine claim contesting the ground. He chose a spot roughly 200 miles north of Thebes, on the eastern bank of the Nile, in a natural amphitheater of cliffs and desert that opened toward the sunrise. He named the city Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. He ordered its construction to begin immediately. Within roughly 2 years, an entire city rose from bare ground. Palaces, administrative buildings, a vast great temple of the Aten, open to the sky, royal tombs cut into the surrounding cliffs, workshops, barracks, suburbs for tens of thousands of people who would need to be relocated from Thebes to staff the new capital. The pharaoh, his queen, his 6 daughters, and his entire court moved north. They walked away from 2,000 years of Egyptian tradition. They left the priesthood of Amun in Thebes to sit in their emptied temples, watching the world they had built for 1,000 years drain away toward the horizon. Akhetaten was, by any measure, one of the strangest cities ever built by human hands. It sat in a natural bay of cliffs on the eastern bank of the Nile, in a location that had literally no previous history. No village had ever stood there. No god had ever been worshipped on that specific stretch of ground. That was, in fact, the point. Akhenaten had chosen the site precisely because it carried no religious baggage, no older claims, no ancestral spirits, no established rituals that would have to be honored or displaced. It was a blank canvas, chosen on purpose, on which to build a city that had never been imagined before. He marked the boundaries himself. 15 enormous stelae, carved stone slabs, were placed at strategic points around the perimeter of the new territory. Each one bore an inscription in his own words, swearing that he would never expand the city beyond these limits, that he would never leave it, and that when he died, he would be buried within the boundaries he had drawn. These are among the most personal statements any pharaoh ever left in stone. They read less like royal proclamations and more like the private oath of a man who has staked everything on a single decision and does not intend to walk it back. The city rose with astonishing speed. Modern excavations, which have been ongoing at the site, now called Amarna, after the modern Egyptian village that sits nearby, since the 19th century, have revealed the outlines of an urban plan that housed perhaps 20 to 30,000 people at its peak. There was a great temple of the Aten, open to the sky, its offering altars flooded with direct sunlight throughout the day. There was a smaller royal temple. There was a central palace complex where Akhenaten and Nefertiti lived and conducted the business of state. There were entire suburbs of ordinary houses, many of them still visible in outline today, being carefully re-excavated by the Amarna project team under Anna Stevens and her colleagues, who published their most recent findings in 2025. Within Akhenaten, a genuinely new culture began to emerge, one that departed from Egyptian tradition in ways that went far beyond religion. The art of the Amarna period is unmistakable to anyone who has seen it. Traditional Egyptian art had for 2,000 years followed a specific set of conventions. Pharaohs were depicted as young, muscular, idealized figures. Bodies were shown in a formal composite view, head in profile, shoulders squared to the viewer, hips turned. Facial expressions were serene, distant, timeless. Amarna art broke every one of those rules. Akhenaten himself was depicted with an elongated skull, drooping features, a soft belly, wide hips, and thin, almost feminine limbs. Nefertiti and their daughters were shown with the same elongated skulls, the same soft bodies. In some reliefs, the royal family is portrayed in genuinely intimate scenes. The pharaoh kissing his daughter on the mouth, or the family eating together at a table while the sun disk shines down and its rays end in tiny hands offering the ankh, the symbol of life, directly to the royal family's nostrils. Nothing like this had ever been carved in Egypt before, and nothing quite like it would be carved again after Akhenaten's death. The medical mystery of why Akhenaten and his family were depicted this way remains genuinely unresolved. A comprehensive 2025 medical review published in the journal Rewrote revisited the entire debate and reached a careful conclusion. None of the leading diagnostic theories, whether Marfan syndrome, aromatase excess syndrome, or Klinefelter syndrome, can explain all of the features together. It is possible the art is stylistic rather than realistic, exaggerating physical traits for symbolic reasons we don't fully understand. It is possible Akhenaten actually did have some kind of hereditary condition that manifested across the royal family. It is possible both are true at once. What is certain is that the artistic revolution he presided over was not accidental. Someone decided this new visual style, and the pharaoh approved it, and thousands of skilled craftsmen were retrained to produce it. For roughly a decade, Akhenaten functioned. The court was there. The administration operated from there. Foreign ambassadors came to Akhenaten to conduct diplomacy. Egyptian scribes wrote in a new, more colloquial form of the language, closer to how ordinary people actually spoke. Hymns to the Aten were composed, some of them, particularly the Great Hymn to the Aten, so lyrically striking that scholars have noted uncanny parallels with certain Hebrew psalms composed centuries later, though whether there is a direct connection remains debated. But even during those years of apparent success, cracks were forming that Akhenaten himself either did not notice or chose not to address. And the most dangerous of them was arriving in a form he probably regarded as beneath his attention. Clay tablets arriving from foreign kings, written in a language most Egyptian scribes could barely read, piling up in an archive at the edge of his new capital while their contents grew more desperate with every passing month. The clay tablets were discovered in 1887 by a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Amarna for the crumbled mud brick that Egyptian farmers used, at the time, as a soil fertilizer. She found something harder than mud brick. She pulled it out of the ground and, not knowing what it was, sold it to a local dealer for what amounted to a few pennies. Within months, more of the tablets began surfacing. Antiquities dealers in Cairo started acquiring them. European museums began to notice. By the time archaeologists arrived at the site to conduct proper excavations, roughly 380 tablets had been recovered, most of them ending up in the Berlin Museum, the British Museum, and the Cairo Museum, where the majority of them still reside today. The tablets are written in cuneiform, in a form of Akkadian that served as the diplomatic language of the entire ancient Near East during this period. And what they contain is one of the most extraordinary windows into ancient international relations that has ever been recovered from any archaeological context anywhere in the world. They are letters, diplomatic correspondence, sent to the Egyptian court by kings, vassal rulers, and governors from across the empire and beyond. From Babylon, from Assyria, from the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia, from Cyprus, from the small city-states that line the Levantine coast under nominal Egyptian control. Some are exchanges between equal powers, Great kings, as they styled themselves, negotiating marriage alliances and gifts of gold. Most, though, are pleased, because the vassal kings of the Egyptian empire were in trouble, and their letters make it painfully clear that they were not receiving the help they had been promised. The most striking example, and the one that has become the most famous of the Amarna letters, comes from a man named Rewrote, the king of Byblos, one of the most important Egyptian client cities on the Lebanese coast. Over the course of roughly a decade, Rewrote sent something like 60 letters to the Egyptian court. They begin in the earliest examples as formal diplomatic requests. They end by the last surviving examples as something close to open despair. His city was being besieged. His enemies were expanding. His allies were defecting. He was writing to the pharaoh, repeatedly, urgently, in the traditional formulas of a loyal vassal, begging for troops, for gold, for any acknowledgement that Egypt still remembered he existed. The responses, when they came at all, appear to have been minimal. Whatever Egyptian military support arrived was inadequate to hold the situation together. Rewrote was eventually deposed, and according to the reconstructed narrative, murdered. Byblos was lost. Other letters tell similar stories. The Hittite Empire, based in what is now central Turkey, was expanding aggressively into the northern reaches of what had been Egyptian territory. Small cities along the Levantine coast were switching allegiance from Egypt to whoever could actually protect them. The famous Habaru, a shadowy category of displaced or brigand populations who appear repeatedly in these letters, were pressing against Egyptian holdings in the interior. Vassals begged for help. The help did not come. Meanwhile, at Akhenaten appears to have been focused overwhelmingly on the religious and cultural transformation of his own capital. There is no clear evidence he ever left the city he had built. There is no clear evidence he ever led a military campaign, as most previous New Kingdom pharaohs had done as a routine matter of state. The empire his father and grandfathers had built was fraying at the edges, and the correspondence documenting the fraying was piling up in an archive that, based on where the tablets were eventually found, may not have been read with any real urgency by anyone in a position to act on it. And then, somewhere in the final years of the reign, something else appears to have happened at Akhenaten. Something worse than diplomatic neglect. A 2025 study by Gretchen Dabbs and Anna Stevens, published in the American Journal of Archaeology, reviewed the bioarchaeological evidence from the cemeteries at Amarna in the context of a broader late Bronze Age epidemic that appears to have swept across the eastern Mediterranean during roughly this period. The Amarna cemeteries, particularly the South Tomb Cemetery, where ordinary workers and their families were buried, show evidence of unusually high mortality rates, including significant numbers of children and young adults. Multiple lines of evidence, including Hittite and Egyptian textual references to widespread illness during this era, point to the possibility that some kind of infectious disease was ravaging populations across the region during precisely the years when Akhenaten's reforms were at their peak. Whether the epidemic reached the royal family directly, we cannot yet say with certainty, but the surviving evidence is suggestive. Menkaten, one of Akhenaten's daughters, died young, and her death is depicted on the walls of the royal tomb with a level of raw grief that is almost unprecedented in Egyptian royal art. Nefertiti disappears from the record around the same time. Whether she died, was elevated to a co-regency, or was simply written out of history remains one of the most persistent mysteries in Egyptology. And Akhenaten himself, sometime around 1336 before Christ, after roughly 17 years on the throne, died. The revolution he had built died shortly after him. The city he had founded was abandoned within a few years, and the people who inherited what was left of Egypt began quietly at first to undo everything he had done. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and then get right back into it. If you've stayed with this video through the temples of Amun, the invention of monotheism 700 years before anyone was supposed to have invented it, the strange city in the desert, and the diplomatic collapse of an empire whose vassals were begging for help nobody sent, you're the kind of person who wants a story that survives contact with what the evidence actually shows. That's exactly what this channel exists to make, and we put out videos like this one every single day. Subscribing costs nothing, and it means the next one just shows up. Now, back to what happened after Akhenaten died. Because the erasure of his memory did not happen all at once, and the story of how it happened tells you something important about how thoroughly a civilization can decide, collectively, to forget the parts of its own history that make it uncomfortable. The immediate aftermath is murky, and it is murky specifically because so much evidence was later destroyed. What can be reconstructed goes roughly like this. Akhenaten died around 1336 before Christ. There appears to have been a short, chaotic transition, possibly involving a co-regent or successor named Smenkhkare, whose identity remains one of the most disputed questions in Egyptology and may or may not have been Nefertiti herself, ruling in her own name. This transitional figure lasted perhaps 2 or 3 years, and then the throne passed to a 9-year-old boy who has, through no achievement of his own, become the most famous ancient Egyptian in the modern imagination. Tutankhaten, later renamed Tutankhamun. The name change is the entire point. Tutankhaten meant living image of the Aten, a name that embedded his father's revolutionary religion into his own identity, the same way Akhenaten's own name had done. Within a few years of taking the throne, the young king abandoned Akhetaten, moved the capital back to Thebes, and changed his name to Tutankhamun. Living image of Amun. The exact god his father had spent 15 years trying to erase from Egyptian consciousness was back in the pharaoh's own name, restored to prominence, celebrated openly, funded again by the returned patronage of the crown. The child king almost certainly did not make this decision himself. He was surrounded by advisors, most notably a general named Horemheb and an older courtier named A, who had lived through the Amarna period and had, by the evidence of what they did next, decided it needed to end. The temples of Amun were reopened. The priesthood was restored. The Aten was quietly demoted back to the minor solar deity he had been before Akhenaten's reforms. The revolution was over within a generation of the revolutionary's death. Tutankhamun himself died young, probably around 18 or 19, from causes that DNA testing and CT scans conducted in the 2000s and revisited in the 2025 Curious Medical Review have variously attributed to malaria, a genetic bone disorder, and possible complications from a leg injury. He was buried hastily in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, sealed with such an ordinary set of arrangements that it would sit undisturbed for over 3,000 years before Howard Carter opened it in 1922, the only substantially intact royal tomb ever recovered from ancient Egypt. After Tutankhamun's death, the old courtier A took the throne briefly, and then around 1319 before Christ, the general Horemheb became pharaoh, and Horemheb was the man who decided that Akhenaten had to be erased. He was systematic about it. The Aten temples at Karnak were disassembled block by block. The blocks were then used as core fill for new construction, buried inside the foundations of new pylons and gates, where they would be invisible to any observer, but where their inscriptions would be preserved by the very stones designed to hide them. Modern archaeology has recovered thousands of these reused blocks, which is much of what we now know about the details of Akhenaten's actual religious teachings, because Horemheb's builders inadvertently preserved the very evidence they were trying to bury. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off every surface where it could be reached. His statues were smashed, his tomb was violated, the city of Akhetaten was left to the desert, and when later Egyptian scribes compiled the official king lists, the sequential record of pharaohs that formed the backbone of Egyptian historical memory, Akhenaten was not on them. The name went from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as if the 17 years in between had simply not happened. When later Egyptians did refer to Akhenaten at all, in surviving fragments of temple graffiti or private commentary, they called him the criminal of Akhetaten, or that enemy, never by name. The erasure was so complete that for the next 3,000 years, nobody knew he had existed at all. So here's where all of this actually leaves you. You came into this video with, at most, a vague sense that ancient Egypt had a lot of pharaohs and a lot of gods and a lot of pyramids, and that somewhere in that long sweep of history, there might have been a strange king who did something unusual with the sun. That's the version most people carry when they carry anything at all. It is not wrong. It is just so incomplete that the actual weight of what happened is lost. You now know that a pharaoh who ruled the wealthiest empire on earth in the 14th century before Christ tried to erase the entire religious tradition of a 2,000-year-old civilization and replace it with something no human society had ever attempted. Not a reform, not an emphasis on one god within a pantheon. The first monotheism in recorded human history, invented as state policy, imposed by decree, backed by the full weight of Egyptian gold and Egyptian armies. You know he came close to making it stick. He built a city from nothing to house it. He renamed himself to embody it. He shut down the priesthood that opposed it. For 17 years, the most powerful civilization in the ancient world was officially monotheist. And you know it collapsed the moment he died. His own son, still a child, was renamed by advisors who understood that the revolution could not survive. His temples were disassembled. His name was chiseled off every surface where his hand had rested. The city he had built was abandoned within a year, and the men who took over made the deliberate decision that Egypt would be safer if he had simply never existed. They almost pulled it off. For 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of history from the birth of Christ to now, they succeeded. He was rediscovered by accident. A peasant woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins of a forgotten village in 1887 pulled a clay tablet out of the dirt and sold it for pennies. That tablet and the 380 that followed it opened the door to a civilization that had been sealed shut so thoroughly that nobody knew it had ever been opened. Archaeologists spent the next century reconstructing the reign of a king whose existence had been denied by every source that ancient Egypt itself had left behind. The Amarna project is still working there today. The 2024 and 2025 field seasons uncovered more of the ordinary houses where ordinary people had lived during those 17 years of unprecedented religious experiment. There is more still to find. Here's the part worth carrying with you longest, though, because it is the part that no amount of archaeology can quite finish answering. If Akhenaten's reforms had held, if his monotheism had survived him even one generation longer, if his son had grown into an adult who chose to preserve his father's revolution rather than dismantle it, the religious history of the entire human species would be different. The great monotheistic traditions we now consider foundational to Western civilization would have emerged into a world that had already been monotheist for centuries. The idea of a single god would not have arrived from a small tribal people in the Levant during the exile in Babylon. It would have arrived from the Egyptian imperial court 700 years earlier at the height of the Bronze Age, with all the cultural gravity that Egyptian civilization at its peak could impart. That is not an exaggeration. Egyptian influence on the neighboring cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean during this period was immense. Egyptian gold-shaped economies, Egyptian art-shaped iconographies, Egyptian religious ideas, even in their traditional polytheistic form, filtered outward through trade, through diplomacy, through the movement of scribes and soldiers and traders across the entire region. A monotheism successfully institutionalized in Akhenaten's Egypt would have had every advantage that any religious idea in human history has ever had. It would have been carried by the most powerful empire in the world. It didn't happen because a few advisors around a 9-year-old boy decided it wouldn't. Because a general named Horemheb, 13 years later, decided the safer path was to pretend the whole thing had never occurred. Because the priesthood of Amun, sitting in their emptied temples for 15 years, had waited patiently for the storm to end. History turns on these decisions, not on the ones that are debated in official histories, but on the quiet, practical, unrecorded moments when someone with the authority to preserve or destroy something makes the decision to destroy it, and no one alive at the time thinks it particularly noteworthy. Akhenaten is on your screen tonight because a peasant woman in 1887 found something interesting in the dirt. Everything else that came after, the reconstructed history, the museum exhibits, the DNA analysis of the KV-55 mummy that finally, in 2010, confirmed his biological identity as the father of Tutankhamun, flows from that single accidental discovery. If she had thrown the tablet back into the ground and moved on, we might not know he had existed at all. The lesson is not about Akhenaten. The lesson is that we do not actually know which parts of our own present are the ones that will be remembered, and which are the ones someone will decide, in the years after, would be safer forgotten. Every era has its Akhenatens. Most of them succeed at being erased. He is one of the few who didn't. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day, the version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment. A real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what king, what forgotten figure, what quiet piece of erased history you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.